Okay, good morning. This is the rerun of Napoleon, the Making of the Louvre. This talk is going to talk not only about what Napoleon did, but what the French revolutionary troops did all together. I'm sure that you are aware of Napoleon's as a military leader, as an empire builder, also as quite a good administrator. Under his reign, a lot of interesting things were done on the running of the school system and enlarging the school system to everybody. Also the keeping of records, and something that is still relevant up to date is changing the code of law. It wasn't his making, but he directed a whole council to put together a new code of law that had been started before him, but that was making it a much more equitable kind of code of law that took his name. It's called the Napoleonic Code of Law, and it's still in vigor right now. It's still used by many countries in Europe. But the part that we generally know less about is the influence he exerted in the world of art. During the revolution, many works of art had been appropriated from private collections and from the French royal palaces, from the Roman Catholic Church, and all that had been stored. And then finally, when they decided to use the Louvre as a museum to display all these works of art so that everybody could have access to it, they were set there. And this is going to be similar to the art that is will be plundered from various nations. And it is really under the wing of Napoleon that the Louvre, as we now know, is born. He will get it organized, and then particularly will name Dominique Vivant-Denon as his new director. Denon will be also the director of the Palace of Versailles and other chateaus that belong to the crown. And so he's going to order different alteration, enlarge a gallery to display the classical art that had been gathered, and then open the large gallery, which is called the Grande Galerie, make some skylights into it, so to enhance the lighting of the gallery too, and the possibility of seeing the works much better. Just a minute. Yeah, there we are. So Vivant-Denon was an interesting figure. He actually accompanied Napoleon to Egypt, and this is where they really met, and Napoleon appreciated him very much. And when they came back in November, a little later, in November 1802, Napoleon appointed Vivant-Denon as director of the Louvre, the Museum of Versailles, and the Royal Castles collection. He was known as Napoleon's eye. He continued actually to travel with the French military expedition to Italy, to Germany, to Austria and Spain, with the purpose of selecting artworks for France. As I mentioned, he translated, if you want, the wishes of Napoleon in improving the Louvre's layout, the lighting, and also implementing new museology ideas. So under Napoleon and him, Paris became a showcase for art, and Napoleon's taste and power were highly visible, which is a kind of propaganda, as you know. Vivant Denon and his architects got inspired by some works by Hubert Robert, who was a great artist of the 18th century, who spent a big portion of his career in Italy, where he got inspired by the works of Piranesi. And you can see on the left an imaginary view of the Grande Galerie in the Louvre in ruins, which was that kind of capriccio that Piranesi was doing in Italy on some of the antique monuments, showing either the unfortunately the bad condition they were in, or sometimes inventing some bad condition for buildings that didn't even exist anymore. But it's really interesting when you compare the one on the work on the left and the work on the right, to see that in fact that capriccio that he had done of the Grande Galerie became an inspiration for opening the ceilings of the Grande Galerie, which was a uniformly closed ceilings. It was that regular ceiling with the caisson finish to alter the sound so that you wouldn't have an echo, and opening that ceiling with skylights, which would enhance greatly the visibility of the art. This became actually the inspiration for the architects that reproduced more or less that fact. Just wanted to attract your attention to the upper left painting showing within the gallery the Apollo Belvedere. This painting was done in 1796, which is when the Apollo Belvedere was taken from the Vatican and brought to Paris. So on the one on the right, you can see not only an enhanced lighting, but the enormous quantity of work of art that were displayed in the Grand Gallery. Now, we have to realize that that whole plunder of Europe started before Napoleon had anything to say about it. In fact, it had started before the Directoire, the directory that was implemented in 1795. A group of 5 people held all the administration of France in their hands. And they had succeeded to the Convention Nationale, which was a large group of people that were supposed to lead the country, but that didn't work really well. So the plunder of Europe started actually with what were called the Spanish Netherlands, which is now Belgium. The revolutionary troops had invaded that part of Europe and literally did what they had done in many places in France. They not only dismantled monasteries because they were very much anti-religion, anti-clerical, dismembered these monasteries, but also burned them down, demolished a lot. There was a real iconoclasm going on until some artists and people that knew better put a stop to it and said, you know, we can do something with that. Instead of demolishing and burning, let's try to capitalize on these works of art. It can be either, if they were of precious metal, they can be melted and used as currency that would help financing the armies that were taking a lot of money. And also they would bring in works of art, and depending on their importance, would either display them at the Louvre, or they would sell them in auction, and with the money again would finance the troops. So the Directoire was made of 5 people. 2 of them, probably a little more known to you, is Barras, who was more or less the head of that Directoire, very ambitious man coming from a small aristocratic family, but led then group of 5 people very much and wasn't liked by the others, but was a very worldly type of man, getting regularly important intellectual people in his house with the salon. And it is at Barras' place that Napoleon will meet Josephine, by the way. Carnot was another interesting figure. He was an army captain at the beginning of the revolution and then became climbed up in the hierarchy and the importance of the political system. He was a very efficient manager and reconstructed the French military. But as they say, he was easy to fool and without intrigues, which was just the opposite of Barras. So the Directory decided to endow the capital of freedom with the masterpieces to which Italy owes its reputation, so that the charm of the soothing and consoling arts may be added to the shining military trophies. This is starting in 1796 with the Italian campaign, but it started, as I mentioned, in the Austrian Netherlands, otherwise known as Belgium, where they are going to create a council which is going to overlook the plunder of the Netherlands. In 1795, they had also invaded what was known at that time as the Netherlands, which is now the Northern Netherlands, which was a republic. Because it was a republic, they couldn't find any legal way of plundering the country, except for the collection of the stadtholder, who was hated in the Netherlands at that time. And so they found a good way of appropriating most of his vast collection of art, of geological samples and botanical samples too. And this is an idea of the main cities that were plundered by Napoleon, his troops, and also the revolutionary troops. The idea of museum, by the way, preceded the idea of Napoleon, but then the way that the National Convention was looking at it, they had split Europe into provinces in the way the Roman Empire was divided. And so they decided to put some museums in many of the main cities, and these are 2 examples of museums that were implemented by the French in Mainz, the Landesmuseum, and in Milan, the Pinacoteca di Brera, which was founded by them, and then was able to display works that were previously in private collections and now accessible to the people. So the way the whole system of war happened in France and in Europe at that time are named by the first coalition, second coalition, which means it's the French against various allies. And this is going to be very fluid, depending on which coalition we're talking about. It always has the British, and it will have what are known as the German states, because Germany doesn't exist at that time, Austria, of course, Italy, and so on. And of course, Russia, which is going to step in also. So I'm not going to go into the details of this war of coalition. And here, between 1792 and 96, this was not handled by Napoleon, but by various other generals. In this case, we have the Lieutenant Jacques-Luc Barbier-Walbon, who was handling the troops invading the what is now Belgium. And I think we can understand better what was happening by looking at some of extracts of what these people said. Here, the fruits of genius are the heritage of liberty. The immortal works of Rubens, Van Dyck, and other founders of the Flemish school are no longer in a foreign land. They are today deposited in the homeland of arts and genius, in the homeland of liberty and holy equality in the French Republic. So they really look at it as the France becomes the place, if you want, that kind of huge vessel in which all the good art of Europe is going to be concentrated, just because of what they have accomplished in kicking out that absolute monarchy, which was leading France for a long time and abusing many of the French. And so they thought that because they had done that extraordinary thing, they were the only one in Europe to deserve to own all these works of art. Some of the works they took are works by Rubens, and some of these early works that he did just coming back from Italy, where he had spent close to 10 years. The first work was the Raising of the Cross, that originally was hanging in the church of St. Walburga, that you can see on this engraving, was the adorning the main altar, and you can see it all the way at the end in the apse of the church, that you could access through staircase, which explained very well, I think, the incredible perspective that Rubens was using in that work. When the French invaded Belgium, St. Walburga, which was a monastic church, was sold for a few pennies to a merchant. The monastery was completely flattened, demolished. And they took, of course, the painting that you might be more familiar with. This is the main painting, not including the upper part, which disappeared, by the way, and shows the famous Raising of the Cross, typical of the early works of Rubens, extremely muscular physiques for men, extreme emotion for the witnesses of Christ being raised on the cross, an extraordinary work, which was finally sent back to Belgium and is now hanging on the Lieve Vrouwenkerk, the cathedral in Antwerp. St. Walburga, unfortunately, was finally demolished because Napoleon wanted to straighten up the River Scheldt, and it was in its way. The other work is the pendant to that painting on the Lieve Vrouwenkerk, the Descent from the Cross, also an extraordinary work, early work by Rubens. But beside these works by Rubens, were also brought in the central part of the adoration of the mystic lamp. So just this part of the panel was brought in, not the wings. And you might wonder why they would bring into France these very highly religious works when they were so anti-clerical. But there, the quality of the work was more important to them than the religious subject. They also brought in the only work that had left Italy during Michelangelo's lifetime, the Madonna and Child, that were that is displayed in Livre Vrouwenkerk, also in Bruges this time. Very beautiful early work. This was done about the same time as the early Pietà by Michelangelo. And that was also brought to the Louvre. They not only were content to bring some paintings and statues, but also decide to take 10 of the most beautiful and very old columns that were in the Imperial Chapel in Aix-la-Chapelle in Aachen, a very old building where Charlemagne was supposed to be buried. And when came time to send back all that loot that had been taken by the revolutionary troops, Vivant Denon tried to prove to the people that were claiming these columns back that they couldn't be, because they had been integrated, as you can see to the right, into the architecture of the Louvre itself, and that it might endanger the ceiling and the roof of these galleries if they were removed. That was an interesting response. In the Netherlands, part of the collection of the Stadtholder was that very large painting. It's over 2 meters by 3 meters and hangs now in the Mauritshuis in The Hague. This is the painting by Paulus Potter of the young bull. And this is very interesting because it's completely different to the other paintings we saw, but the Parisian crowd apparently fell so much in love with it that they really didn't want to send it back to the Netherlands when came the time. Really interesting painting because it shows the very good and favorable economy of the Netherlands in the mid-17th century that were producing such beautiful animals. Though when a specialist look at the young bull, he's actually composition made of 5 different young bulls because they are different parts of his body that correspond to different ages. So finally, when came the time, they reluctantly let it go back and can be seen in the Mauritshuis in The Hague. Napoleon, after meeting Baha, was given by Baha the leading part of the first Italian campaign in 1796. Baha had very quickly judged the young man, who was extremely young at that time, just a little over 20, and realized that he better keep him at arm's length because he was so ambitious and talented, didn't want to keep him too close to Paris, and gave him what actually at that time was the weakest and the worst equipped of all the troops. The troops were divided depending on the front that they were facing. But Napoleon was so smart in that and so charismatic that within a few months, he was able to give the army new uniforms and new weapons, and gave an enthusiasm to these troops that made them winner all along. Now, when we talk about the plunder, we have to realize that starting with the first Italian campaign, everything that was taken from Italy was done through a series of treaties that were including, each treaty, peace treaty, included a list of objects that were to be sent to France. And this, which is quite ironic, also had to, often the people that own these works of art had to pay for the transportation to France. So the commission that had existed already in the Austrian Netherlands was now enlarged and perfected, actually, and really gathered a series of very knowledgeable people that put together list of works of arts, of geological samples, books. A lot of books were taken from libraries, collections of cameos and coins and so on. And so they put together, they knew which rich people had collections that were valuable and they wanted to appropriate. The librarian of the Bibliothèque Nationale had compiled extensive list of the Italian book they desired. And so all along with the Treaty of Leoben, the Armistice of Cherasco, the Armistice of Bologna, Treaty of Tolentino, and the Treaty of Campo Formio, which were the two main ones, the troops went on, would win over a city and then request these list of works that had to be sent to Paris. And so they did it in Parma, in Milan first, in Parma, and then came close to Venice, where the Venetians saw them coming and were trying to convince Napoleon not to enter the city, trying to prove to him that there was no need at all, that they were his friends. But Napoleon quickly found some really good reason to enter the city. Just a little sample of the kind of works that were taken. From Milan was taken the Codex Atlanticus, that is now back in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, though many leaves are missing and are in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. This beautiful Codex Atlanticus that was gathered between 1478 and 1519 contained some of these spectacular drawings by Leonardo, including the design for a giant crossbow, design that he was doing for the Duke of Milan. Sometimes the works were not just taken, but really damaged. And this is an example of a painting by Rubens during his stay in Italy of the Gonzaga family in Mantua. And when I saw that painting first, it didn't make a lot of sense. And then you realize why it didn't. When the soldiers saw the painting at first, they started cutting that painting in pieces. It's a very large painting. And you can see here the reconstruction of what the painting would have looked like in black and white. And only the pieces that are left, that are extant and are still in the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua, but as you can see, far from the splendor of the original work. And by the way, some of the side canvases were taken over the Alps, and some can be found today in Northern Europe. The baptism is in Antwerp and the Transfiguration in Nancy, in Nancy. Other works were taken. This is one taken from Parma by Correggio. Correggio was very famous and quite appreciated in France. And so the Madonna and Child with Saint Jerome and Mary Magdalene were taken to Paris, and where they were originally in Parma Cathedral. It's now in the Galleria Nazionale in Parma. An interesting request by the French when works were returned is that they should be visible, made visible to everybody, which means they should not go back into private collection, but visible to the whole population. During that passage in Parma and Modena, they took entire collections of medals, collections of cameo and engraved semi-precious stones. Just to give you an idea, on the 17th of October, after taking many manuscripts and antique books from the Ducal Library, they shipped 1,213 items, 900 bronze imperial Roman coins, 124 coins from Roman colonies, 44 coins from the Greek cities and papal coins, etc. They were all sent to the Bibliothèque Nationale, where, by the way, they still reside. When in February 1797, Josephine took up residence at the Ducal Palace of Modena, she wished to see the collection of cameos and precious stone, and she took about 200 of them. And in addition to the one that had been taken by her husband. Also 1,300 drawings that were found in the Este collection was sent to the Louvre, as well with cameos and precious stones. The famous Andrea Mantegna's Xenopolyptic was taken to Paris, and there is a very good example when I mentioned and I emphasize the importance of what you call the predella, which are these small paintings below the central panels of the altarpiece. The whole painting was taken to Paris, but when it was sent back to Verona, the predellas had been dismantled, and unfortunately they stayed in France. When you see the San Zeno altarpiece nowadays, the predellas are just copies of the original. Now, the importance of these predellas, as I emphasize that, come from the fact that the main panels were very much forced onto the artist. The artist had to follow what the donor wanted, which means if it had to be very traditional in setting, etc., and then held by clerics that would make sure that he was following the narrative that was desired. But in the predella, the artist had much more freedom, and often we find that they are much more advanced in style than the main panel. And so look at the bottom central panel of the crucifixion is an absolute masterpiece for Mantegna, where he really enjoys showing his mastery of perspective, and with great proof of his understanding of foreshortening, etc. But certainly we have here a real landscape with sky and clouds, and then that route that goes all the way to Jerusalem on the left, but also showing the great emotion of the Virgin and the other Marys. And so that work, don't be surprised, is in Paris nowadays. So finally, Napoleon and his troops made it to Venice. And of course, very quickly, the central interest was on the St. Mark horses. These horses that had themselves been plundered by the Venetian from Constantinople. These, by the way, are not bronze, they are made of copper. And so these 4 horses were taken down and taken to Paris, and fortunately were returned later on. Here is an engraving dating back to 1797, so made at the same time as the thing happened, and shows the horses being taken from St. Mark Basilica and on their way to Paris, where they will be put on top of the Arc de Triomphe of the Carousel in Paris. And you can see this with this later engraving showing the military review during the Empire. It shows the horse of St. Mark on top of the Carousel. As I mentioned, these were returned to Venice, and there is another group of horses now on top of the carousel. In Venice, they had the list of course, the biggest name, and we can see the very, very large Last Judgment by Tintoretto, which measures 14 meters by almost 6 meters, taken from the church of Madonna dell'Orto, and fortunately returned. And of course, they knew enough people. The person put in charge of the removal of all these extremely large paintings in Venice was a conservator who had great reputation, who had worked with many of these works to restore them, and but was also aware of the fragility of these works. And when the moment came to remove the famous Veronese, the marriage at Cana, he did all he could to try to convince them not to take it, because he knew that because of the sheer size of the painting, which was made of a series of canvases that were sewn together, some drama was going to happen. And indeed, when they started pulling this down from the monastery's refectory, just the weight of the canvas, when they undid it from the stretcher, the weight of the canvas make it come down before they could roll it, and literally was sheared from the other part. So the painting was considerably damaged just in undoing it from the stretcher, and then was rolled in 2 or 3 parts. Not everybody agrees. Rolled carefully with having some paper in between the different layers so that the pigment wouldn't adhere to the back of the painting. And then the whole box was stuffed with other fabrics to prevent it to move, but it's still, because of the sheer weight of all that, it would still crash, and by the time it arrived in Paris, it was in bad condition. Now, that famous painting is the subject of Cynthia Saltman's book, which is a very well-researched book, and explains how when it arrived in Paris, it stayed in storage for a while before they could open it, put it back together, and be able to showcase it in the Louvre. When Napoleon finally abdicated in 1815, the sculptor Canova was put in charge of going back to Paris and try to reclaim all the works that belonged to Italy to go back. And he dealt with Vivant de Nom, who was a very smart guy, and unfortunately, in many ways, got fooled by Vivant de Nom, who wanted to keep many of these works of art, including this one. And Vivant de Nom convinced Canova that this painting was too fragile to make it back to Italy. The travel would be too dangerous for the painting, and so they agreed in common to leave it in Paris and be replaced by this painting by Charles Lebrun, who was a 17th century painter, who was the one in charge of the decoration of Versailles, by the way, but was nothing compared to the Veronese. And this is how the painting hangs now. I mean, this shows the Noces de Cana in 2013, hanging in the Louvre. You have an idea of the sheer size of the painting. And that painting, you know, with the wars and so on, was moved many times in the late 19th century during the Franco-Prussian War. it was stored in a box in Brest, in Brittany. During the Second World War, the painting was rolled up for storage and continually transported to hiding places throughout the south of France until it became part of the Nazi plunder and was stolen during the 12-year existence of the Third Reich. Then it was going to be restored. This was kind of controversial. Many people thought that the cleaning had gone too far. They recovered some old colors of some of the figures at the front of the painting, and but they had the feeling that the color had been changed by Veronese himself. So a lot of controversy. But then interesting, in 1992, 3 years into the restoration of the painting suffered twice accidental damage. In the first one, the canvas was spattered with rainwater that leaked into the museum through an air vent. And in the second accident, which occurred 2 days later, the curators were raising the 1.5-ton painting to a higher position when the support frame failed and collapsed. And in doing so, the painting was punctured by the framework. So you see, life of painting is not an easy thing. Just a few words. The opinions in France were different. Let's say the majority was for bringing these works of art, but some others were against. And Quatremer de Quincy said eradicating the context in which the work was created irreparably impairs its legibility. But most of people, this is an extract of a petition from French artists, really give the idea how the French population at that time felt as towards the rest of Europe. So this is an extract. The Romans, once an uncultivated people, became civilized by transplanting to Rome the works of conquered Greece. Thus, the French people, naturally endowed with exquisite sensitivity, will, by seeing the models from antiquity, train its feeling and its critical sense. The French Republic, by its strength and superiority of its enlightenment and its artists, is the only country in the world which can give a safe home to these masterpieces. All other nations must come to borrow from our art as they once imitated our frivolity. And of course, when they talk about that, they talk about the Rococo art and other things that were rather light. More of the work, these are works that come from Rome, because after doing the works, taking the works in Venice, then they knew, the Pope in the papal state knew that Napoleon could invade the whole place and tore it down. And so they very quickly asked for a peace treaty. And one of the last paintings by Raphael was part of the lot. I'm only showing, of course, some selected works. This is the famous Transfiguration, which was supposed to end up on top of Raphael's tomb, was previously in San Pietro in Montorio, and now is part of the Pinacoteca in the Vatican. Also part of the list was the Caravaggio, The Entombment, also taken from the Chiesa Nuova in Rome, and then now part of the Pinacoteca in the Vatican. Quite an enormous amount of statues were also taken, mostly classical antique statues. This is the famous Apollo Belvedere, a marble copy of the bronze original that was part of the Vatican, and of course one of the most classical example of the beauty of the Greek sculptures. It was considered as really one of the greatest of the ancient sculpture at that time. The famous group of the Laocoon and his sons were taken. And this is just a huge group, it's life-size. The Daingon, also a really interesting Hellenistic sculpture, very much more dramatic and expressive. The Tiber, at that time, the river, the great rivers were personified by gods, and you can see here the showing the Tiber god with the corn of abundance and horn of plenty, sorry. And then you see the she-wolf and the twins feeding on her. Now, the Tiber is an interesting example. It's a very large sculpture, larger than life-size, as you can see. It's over 3 meters long. Was considered by Vivant de Non as non-transportable because too heavy. And he convinced Canova that it should stay in the museum. The famous Venus de Medici, also the female standard at that time for so many paintings. That was an inspiration for so many. Also smaller pieces like the Gonzaga Cameo that was previously in the Vatican collection. That's a really old 3rd century BCE cameo that was taken. And interestingly, as you can see, is now in the Hermitage Museum. It's part of the works that were given to Josephine, and then when the Tsar Alexander had come to help them, Josephine gave it to him as a thank you. As you can imagine, all these works, the transportation of the large works, were very difficult. Jean-Antoine Gros, who was accompanying these transport procession, if you can say, the really incredible amount of carriages that were in carts that were carrying all these works, extremely heavy works, through the landscape, to the northern part of Italy. And you can imagine, as he shows there on the right, how to control the bulls, that sometimes it was so heavy that to prevent on the slope the carriages to run down the oxen. They had to attach oxen behind, which would slow down the descent. And arriving in Paris, then these things were processed all around Paris for the population to see. And so here you have an idea of different of the great sculptures and paintings, including in the center, the 4 horses coming from Venice. And you can even see some dromedaries in following that. It's even recorded on some vases, that beautiful vase, what they call Etruscan vase with scrolls, is literally commemorating the arrival of all these works of art in Paris, including the Laocoon. But Vivant de Non also liked, which was unusual at that time, but the older art, the pre-Renaissance, proto-Renaissance works by Cimabue and Giotto. And so he went back to Italy and decided to take possession of one of the Maesta by Cimabue that was originally in Pisa. And that kind of work was never returned. It is still in the Louvre. And a lot of the works, we have to realize there was too much for the Louvre. A lot of the kind of secondary works were sent to the province, to provincial museums in France and others. And these normally, Canova never had access to them. And so these, most of the time, have stayed in France. Same thing with the Giotto of St. Francis receiving the stigmata, was also in Pisa and has remained in France. So another comment by the French is, the enemies of the arts and of the Republic affect to lament the removal of the monuments of Italy. They forget that they have never charged the Romans with committing a crime in taking from the vanquished Greeks the statues with which they decorated the Capitol, the temples, and the squares of Rome. These very statues which the French have taken from the degenerate Roman Catholics to adorn the Museum of Paris and to distinguish by the most noble of trophies the triumph of liberty over tyranny and of philosophy over superstition. Real conquests are those made on behalf of the arts, the sciences, and taste, and they are the only ones capable of consoling for the misfortune of being compelled to undertake them from other motives. And so this gives you the idea how superior they thought they were, because they had gone against that long time established monarchy. Comes the campaign of Egypt by Napoleon in 1798. Napoleon, when he went to Egypt, was accompanied by 160 artists and scientists who, as soon as they arrived there, started really looking around, copying things, selecting things to be taken to France. And of course, also discovered the buried Rosetta Stone that they discovered there, and which is going to later, thanks to Champollion, enable people to understand the hieroglyphs. Now, very quickly, and because of a strategic mistake, the French fleet is going to be vanquished by the British. And the British are going to see all the things that the French had gathered, as you can see on the right, for example, including the Rosetta Stone, and they're going to take themselves, literally decide that all that these interesting works of art should not go to France, but should go to London. And this is why the Rosetta Stone is in the British Museum now, and by the way, is reclaimed by the Egyptian right now who want it back. That Rosetta Stone, of course, that was written in hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek, allowed Champollion in the 1815 to start looking at it and be able to translate these hieroglyphs. And of course, his followers went on with that duty. And here you can see how the troops are putting together all that group of beautiful art. In 1804, Napoleon, who had been quite admired in many places in Europe because of the fact that he had shaken down the weaknesses of the French Revolution, that he had been such an incredible conqueror, but had also, as I said, implemented new ideas in France, decided, to the surprise of many, to consecrate himself as emperor. This is going to be a deception to many who just see him doing what had been done before and sees the power just pushing away the will of the people. And then as soon as he's crowned emperor, he leaves again and goes on the field, and during the battle of wins the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, again with a series of treaties that are very clear, define the works of art that have to be taken from the private collections that the countries they have taken, and this should be sent back to France. And we see, for example, the removal of the arts from the gallery in Kassel, where they take paintings and sculptures, and all that is sent back to Paris. In Spain, the brother of Napoleon, Joseph Bonaparte, is going to become king. And then when in 1813, he has to flee after being beaten by Wellington. He was himself quite an art amateur, and he goes away himself with lots of art. Though under his reign, many private collections had been transferred to what is going to become the Prado, and be so centered to be in a museum where people could see it. But there, the art is going to take a different trip, is that to thank Wellington for what he had done by liberating Spain from the Bonapartes. A lot of paintings that are going to be given to Wellington. Not this one. This is the Murillo Immaculate Conception that comes from a collection and is going to end up in the Prado. But on the other hand, paintings like the Water Cellar by Velázquez is now in the Apsley House in London, was part of 80 paintings given to the general to thank him for what he had done. And then finally, with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon is abdicating for good. He actually had abdicated previously and was sent, Tucker, and was sent to Elba, but he only stayed a few weeks in Elba and then was brought back to France by his admirers, which were many, by the way. A lot of people just adore Napoleon. And he's going to stay in France for 100 days, go on with his battle. He was a man on the field. This is what he wanted. But he's going to be beaten by the last coalition in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium. And this is when he's going to be sent to St. Helena. And this is when finally the big work is going to happen, is that how are they going to send back this art? The French were not ready at all. For them, most of what they had was done legally through treaties. And so there is an interesting remark by a London paper in 1815 that gives an idea of the way Europe feels. They clamor loudly to be allowed to keep the articles of art. And why? By what right? The right of conquest? Then have they not twice lost them? Do they persist in enforcing that right? Then why do not now the Allies plunder France of every article worth removing, which he possessed before Bonaparte's time? They are entitled to do this by the example of Bonaparte's practice, now so eagerly sanctioned by the Parisians. So this is one point of view. But as a conclusion, just to try to summarize what happened. By January 1815, the Louvre and the Royal Library had relinquished only 6 paintings, 46 marbles, and 52 bronze statues, 461 carved gems, and a few manuscripts. The French were very opposed to send back all the things, and particularly the one to Belgium, because that was not part of treaties, but they wanted to absolutely keep them, and there really was a lot of pressure pushed on them before they agreed. The wedding feast at Cana had been torn in two pieces in the journey from Venice to Paris and restored in a way that made it even harder to move. So a painting by the French artist Charles Lebrun was offered as substitute. Later, it was concluded that the Louvre had lost 2,065 paintings, 130 statues, 150 bas-reliefs and busts, 289 bronzes, 281 sketches, 105 ivory vases, 75 vases in precious metal, 16 Etruscan vases, 37 wooden sculptures, 471 cameos, and 1,199 enamels. 10 of the marble pillars that had been removed from the cathedral at Aix-la-Chapelle or Aachen had been incorporated into one of the galleries of the Louvre. So it was feared that their removal could cause the vaulted roof to collapse. So they were allowed to stay there. Really interesting. Josephine died, by the way, in early 1815. So when the Essiens went to the Malmaison, where Josephine used to live, to collect 48 paintings from Castle that had been given to Josephine, they were told that the finest pieces in the collection had been sold to Tsar Alexander of Russia, who refuses to give them up. But the bulk of the art objects in France at this time were never returned to their owners. Touring Le Louvre to see that what remained, Louis XVIII reportedly remarked, "We are still rich." And this is the end. I give you a bibliography. You have it in the flyers that I sent you. So there are two main works that deal with this. And then the next presentation will be on Thursday, 2 days from now, on Orientalism, Ingres de la Croix, and others. And so now I'm going to bring back the participant, and you can unmute yourself if you want. Let me just stop the recording.